this crisis of manhood is rooted in a crisis of fatherhood. We're all recovering materialists.
Right.
It's kind of like when you read Notes from the Underground, you know, and you relate with the main character, or Crime and Punishment. You understand Raskolnikov. You know, that's a real uncomfortable feeling, but that's what we're coming out of.
You got to watch your thoughts. You have to watch the mental images, because everything begins there. And most people, before coming to Orthodox, they've never heard it articulated that way.
O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
The whole masculinity crisis is that what's being attacked here is the whole notion of maleness. Now, let me say something else, and this gets a little abstract, but it's really important. You know, one of the loves of God towards mankind is called eros, divine eros, and that's God's creative potency. That's replicated in creation too with sexuality, because the purpose of sexuality is what? It's the creation of new life.
Right.
In that sense, it replicates something of God. We see something of God in the creation. Now, that is where men get hit hard with the porn, with the sexuality. It's just everywhere. Right? But the reason that is because if that can get distorted in man, he'll lose his creative potency. That's what'll happen. You know, you hear in the culture about failure to launch. When I hear failure to launch, I hear a guy who's addicted to porn. And he's, honestly, he's masturbating all the time. What's he doing when he does that? Well, what he's doing is he's draining out all his creative energy. Okay, that's what's going on. And well, why does this happen? Well, because there was no one to guide him. There was no man in his life to guide him on the manly path when he was growing up. That's what's going on. So this crisis of manhood is rooted in a crisis of fatherhood. And every successive generation, it gets worse. I have a theory on that. I think it happened because of World War II. You know, I'm into this cultural stuff. I don't know if this theory is right or not, but you know, Europe reached spiritual exhaustion in World War I. It reached complete spiritual exhaustion. That was the rise of the avant-garde. You mentioned something about the Theotokos and women. I wrote an essay on this once. It's a good essay. But I compared Picasso to an icon of the Theotokos. And Picasso's cubism was he was taking the disfragmentation of his own soul towards the female and putting it on canvas. That's what he was doing. And you could see the devolution throughout his career as a very promiscuous man, serial adulterer. So his life serves as proof of my thesis. Okay? But you look at how he sees woman, and he can only see woman as a fragmented object and an object of sensuality. You compare that, put that side by side with an icon, a beautiful icon of the Theotokos, and you can begin to perceive what that fragmentation really is. And then also, and this is what's frightening, you realize that you can relate to the fragmentation more than you can with the Theotokos. Well, of course we can. We're all recovering materialists. It's kind of like when you read Notes from the Underground, you know, and you relate with the main character, or Crime and Punishment. You understand Raskolnikov. You know, that's a real uncomfortable feeling, but that's what we're coming out of, right? That's what we're coming out of.
Right.
So, men really adopt the disciplines of the church. That's my advice. Look, they talk about toxic masculinity. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity.
Agreed.
There's only toxic people. And toxic people are both male and female. That's just a polemical trick, to make you feel defensive, to make you feel weak. Don't buy it. Just don't buy it. Okay. It's not a legitimate, it's not even a legitimate cultural category, right? It's certainly not an ontological category. It's not a legitimate cultural category either. But this thing about divine eros, let me get back on that. The way a man heals from porn, and St. Maximus the Confessor, I got this from him. And I know I got it from him. I'll tell you how. Because after I developed it, it started with when he said, all desire, even inordinate desire, the sinful desire, is grounded in a desire for God. So I thought, this is just something that's gone off astray. Okay. And it's become habituated, in some cases compulsive, right? But if it's grounded in the desire for God, then it started out as good. So what happened? What happened? It usually happens in adolescence. What happened is that man has a natural creative prowess. And we've all experienced this. When you've done a job, you've done something, and you've done a task, you've done a job, and you've done it well, your soul is gratified. Why? Because you're actualizing your own manhood. That's why. Men are there to build, defend, protect. And you talk to any guy who's got, some sense left, and it just resonates in him, these words and this kind of encouragement. Okay? If a guy mocks you for it, it's because he's sacrificed his manhood on the altar of feminism.
Right.
Or he's so dissipated he can't muster any natural energy anymore. Okay? But so man, instead of, the teenage years, it's the years of growing from childhood into adulthood, but the lack of fatherhood means that most of us don't have mentors. Right? And because fatherhood is diminishing from generation to generation, because I didn't make this point, I didn't finish this point, but because I think the guys, the men from World War II came home so traumatized by that war, because war traumatizes. But then right away, the Hollywood propaganda machine came out with all their movies about the great American hero.
Right.
It was never dealt with. I think these men came home severely wounded. It was never dealt with. Okay, so the boys grew up without the training and the example and the experiences that they needed. The reason I think that is because the whole 60s rebellion really started in 1965. That's only 20 years after World War II.
Right.
And okay, so they grow up and they have children, and their fathering is weaker. And then the generation after that, which is where you guys are at, the fathering's even weaker. Now, this isn't universally true, but it's so broadly true, I can make a generalization like I do, right? And so the boy growing up, he has this desire inside of him, to succeed, to build, to grow, figure out who he is, to meet the challenges. All men do. But he doesn't have a guide, he doesn't have an encourager, and he meets frustration after frustration after frustration. Meanwhile, thanks to O Diavolos, right, all this pornography is there, and it gets channeled into the sex drive, which is also a creative drive, but it hyperinflates the sex drive. And what he's looking for in the orgasm is actually that gratification that comes through the real accomplishment through work. That's what I think is going on.
No, and I think I totally agree with that. One, from my own struggles previously with porn until I was able to get that under control, was one, you never feel good afterwards, but you can feel a sort of dissipation of creative energy. So I noticed I would get most tempted when I needed to sit and read and really focus on something or write a paper. A lot of my work is intellectual or academic. So whenever I really have to focus on something, then I get bombarded with the mental images and
Yep.
the temptations and the passions. And you think, oh, well, I'll just do it real quick and then I'll get back to work and those things will leave me. But then once you participate in that sin, you can feel you have less energy to actually accomplish your goals now. You
Yeah.
have less energy to actually go and make something happen. And that, to me, this is all part of a spiritual problem that is weakening men and failing to. So even the pornography is it's a shortcut to what would they think is going to be a sexual satisfaction, but typically that release, that orgasm, comes from doing things in the world, having some type of social status, meeting a woman, building a relationship, and then eventually having sex. And so there is a journey there. And people are skipping that journey and trying to just get the satisfaction of sex. And it builds this nasty feedback loop where they don't, like you said, a failure to launch. They don't use their creative energies to actually do difficult things, which also decreases their testosterone, which makes it less enjoyable to do difficult things.
Yeah. Yeah. It also creates a sense of inadequacy and deficiency in the boy. And, he's doing this and he's thinking, well, when I get to be 17 or 18, I'm going to quit.
Right.
Then he finds out he can't. That sense of deficiency often arises in the presence of women, because it's a sense of masculine deficiency. He's not as strong as he wants to be. Okay. I always tell guys, I deal with guys a lot with this issue. I always tell them, look, if you have a sense of deficiency, I'm real upfront about stuff like this. I said, well, you should be grateful, because underneath it there is a sense of sufficiency. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel deficient, right? What we got to do is we got to heal the wounds, and we got to apply the disciplines in your life to where those things can be healed, and you can grow and blossom into full manhood.
Right.
And they do. There's a false promise with masturbation. And even though a guy knows it's false, he'll do it anyway, which is that, the orgasm will make me feel whole, will make me feel like a man. But that's only for marriage and your wife, okay? If you rip it out of that context, what's going to happen is exactly what you described. It's a sense of depletion.
Right.
I tell guys, you're flushing all your creative energy down the toilet is what you're doing, literally what you're doing. Now, what happens is once the discipline is starting to be applied, and we do this in this course I designed, it's called Achieving Sexual Integrity, almost immediately their masculine prowess, power, starts to return. And one of the first manifestations of that, this is when they're really putting off the masturbation, the porn use. Porn, I got to tell you, with porn, people say I'm addicted to porn. No, you're not. You're addicted to masturbation. You use porn as a masturbation accelerant.
Right.
Okay? It's just so you can masturbate more and quicker because you get aroused faster.
Right.
Right? You don't really have to self-arouse, right? Just watch the porn and it'll arouse you. That's really what happens, right? But once they lay that aside, apply the Orthodox ascetical self-discipline, which is geared towards ontological reality and the strengthening of the man. That's why we fast. That's why we pray. Then one of the first things that happens is that his mind gets sharper.
Yep.
And often they don't notice that, but I'll ask them, how's your thinking? Is it clearer? And they go, yeah. They realize, yeah, I'm thinking a lot more clearly. Yeah, because you're not dissipating your energy. You're using it in the way that God intended and God created.
Right. Could you speak to, regarding spiritual warfare? I've brought up and read some of the saints talking about the logismy and that it's Orthodox. And I found that this is actually a great apologetic tool for people coming out of the New Age and the occult, because they place so much emphasis on the imagination as being this spiritual dimension within man. And obviously, you're getting to the anthropology, our understanding of the nous and our noetic faculties. Certainly, we're not New Age, but we do believe that we don't have some separate understanding of mind. The nous is part of the soul. The nous is the eye of the soul, the eye of the heart. And we've talked about that the spiritual battlefield is the imagination. And I found this has been really helpful for people coming into Orthodoxy or struggling with pornography or whatever the temptation is. Typically it's lust, and saying like, you got to watch your thoughts. You have to watch the mental images, because everything begins there. And most people before coming to Orthodox, they've never heard it articulated that way, that your imagination, I mean, where is it? It's not within space and time. And so we're able to contact the noetic entities of angels and demons there, but you have to be cautious of who you're contacting and what you're taking in. Could you speak a little bit to the logismy, the imagination, the spiritual warfare that occurs in the mind that people are not conscious of, but need to be more conscious of?
Yeah, well, the logismy, they're the thoughts, okay? But most of our thoughts do not generate within us. See, we believe, and this is Freudian materialism just through the generations. We believe that we generate our own thoughts, but we don't. Most of our thoughts come in from the outside. Once you realize that is very freeing, because some of the thoughts are quite wretched and can be. All right? Things that on your own you would not imagine come into your mind. Because we believe that we generate our own thoughts, then we think, oh, well, I must really be a pervert, or I must really be twisted, right? And then you have this Calvinistic, kind of strain in the culture. It's still in the cultural ethos, right? Man is a wretched sinner, sinners in the hand of an angry God, and the whole forensic justification thing. That doesn't help. Okay, that just doesn't help. Most thoughts come in from the outside. Remember that. But the purification of the mind also starts with the purification of the heart. It's connected to the purification of the heart, because one of the great tragedies of the fall is the disconnection of the mind from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go through the Enlightenment, okay, and where all knowledge is obtained through the mind. That's the presupposition of the Enlightenment, right? That's crashing down around us. It's been a horrible failure, but we still kind of believe the presupposition.
Right.
When I was talking about, okay, giving up the porn and all that and starting the ascetical road, right? The mind clarifies. The mind is to be connected to the heart, because it is a noetic world, all right, but it's apprehended through the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And we have to learn how to discipline our minds as well. You can't discipline the mind outside of prayer. Okay, you just can't. It'll run amok. Now, sometimes what'll happen is guys coming in and they'll really suffer with intrusive thoughts. I mean, they'll just be tortured by it. I understand how that happens. I understand the source and origin of it, but those thoughts, remember, come in from the outside.
Right.
In that case, I pray for them. I pray for them, and I pray the prayer of the evil eye, which is, I know some people are plugging their ears, but it's a light exorcism, okay? And sometimes I'll pray one of the softer exorcism prayers. Now, it doesn't mean they're possessed, but it does mean that there's hyperactive demonic activity taking place, and it'll take the prayer of a priest or another person to push that away. And it will. It'll clear up for them, and they'll have peace. Okay? And And so when those things come, like Elder Paisios said this, St. Paisios now, he says, thoughts are like airplanes. You decide which ones land. But that's what he says. Yeah, he says, don't make your mind an airport.
Right.
But when we come in to Orthodoxy, I mean, we live in a really confused world, right? Especially concerning anthropology. What anthropology? It comes from the Greek anthropos. It means man, especially who and what man is. Most of us don't have a clue until we start coming into Orthodoxy, and then we're taught, and we're also taught the disciplines that we have to apply in order to heal from that confusion. All right. So the spiritual warfare is weak, is real. The demons will play on your weaknesses and vulnerabilities. But the best thing to do, guys, if you suffer with this, is go talk to your priest. Whatever makes manifest is light. That's what confession is.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone struggles with this. You're not the only one. Everyone struggles with this. And especially if you become Orthodox, because Orthodoxy is the antidote. It is the medicine, to spiritual healing. Now, with the mind and the heart, this is how the fathers describe it. The mind gives light. We learn and we see with the mind, but the light is always a reflected light. So the mind is like the sun, the mind is like the moon and the stars. The moon and the stars give light, and sometimes they give a lot of light. They can even show the path at night. But it's a reflected light. It's not the source of light. It's the reflected light of the sun. The light of the sun is apprehended by the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart. The nous, really. The nous is really the center of man, the center of the soul, the center of the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And as you begin the path of purifying your heart, which you do with the Orthodox self-discipline, your mind itself will become enlightened, and you will learn how to push away those thoughts.
Absolutely. And I can speak through my journey as an Orthodox Christian that has absolutely been the case. And getting back to the masculinity and the boundaries, it's that discipline of cleansing our noetic self through our actions first and foremost. And then what I've noticed in my own journey is that you become more sensitive to the places in which you fall. So I noticed when I first joined, okay, pornography, dealing and struggling, and then ending that habitual problem. Well, then you get that under control and you feel like you're doing pretty good, but as I believe, you get closer to Christ and he gives you new eyes to see, literally, as you said, the eye of the heart. You can see where you're coming up shorter in other areas that were kind of darkened. You weren't aware of it. And now you're becoming more aware of like all the other places in your life that you're falling short. And so it's this continual journey of cleansing the heart, cleansing your noetic faculties, and you actually begin to see the world itself more clearly.
Yes. We were talking backstage, and sometimes, okay, a person is about to enter the church and moving towards their baptism, and all of a sudden the spiritual warfare gets intense.
Yes.
And they think I must be doing something wrong.
Yes.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be struggling with these sins so bad. I'm not fit to be baptized. That's demonic activity seeking to discourage you from getting baptized and to keep you out of the church. When you're in the church, you get baptized, you are claimed by God. That's what happens. And that's why we read all the exorcism prayers at the making of a catechumen for your protection. Now, what you've got to do, guys, if this is happening to you, do not isolate. Whatever makes manifest is light. Go to your priest, If you've got a trusted friend and that's the only person you can go to your friend, but talk about this, because once you open the channel, God can speak to you. God can pour his grace into you. Go into prayer. But I understand sometimes that's hard to do when you're getting bombarded.
Right. Well, and as I mentioned to you, I've talked with a few people that, and it typically, and I don't want to, because this is the way that I came into the faith, was more intellectual. It was about learning about the theology, church history, and then becoming rationally convinced of the legitimacy of the Orthodox faith before I really developed actually spiritually, which was the whole point of it. But a lot of us young men are coming to the faith through intellectual means.
Yeah.
And they've put all these dots together. They've come to the correct conclusion, and now they kind of think that once we enter the church, things kind of get better. And that's not the case necessarily. And as you're saying, the temptations or the spiritual warfare heating up is quite normal. And in my own parish, and it's different experiences for different people. When I was brought in, the gentleman before me, who was much older, he's in his 50s, married, he had a beautiful experience. He saw what he believed was uncreated light. He was euphoric for days after his baptism. And for me, I felt like my temptations went up quite dramatically after being brought into the church, and that spiritually it was more difficult. And I've found through conversation that that seems to be the general case for much of the younger men that come into the church. Could you speak to what does the church mean when we say welcome to the arena, when people are brought into the church? And this whole phenomenon, as you're talking about, is the spiritual temptation, the spiritual warfare. It doesn't cease just because you're brought into the ark.
No, because spiritual warfare is a fact of life. So actually what you're doing is you're being ushered into reality. And so what has to go is this idea that comfort is the main goal.
Right.
That's what has to go. Okay. Now, when life was harder, we're a tremendously wealthy country. And we know physical comfort, but this is what some of the later elders have said. That the spiritual issues in the modern world will be primarily psychological. In the earlier world is we pray for the rain and we try and live through the drought and all that.
Right.
But what's happening, guys, when all of a sudden you're shaken up. It was the same for me too, by the way. I read every book there was in Orthodox. There's a lot more now than when I came in, but I read every book, right? And for me it was for an intellectual acceptance too. But of course we're all recovering materialists. I mean, this is why, this is why. It's the only reason why, right? This is the only path open to us until we come into church, and then that path broadens, and then we learn about this other stuff. It's fine. It's just fine that it works that way. Just don't stop.
Right.
That's the main thing. But guys, yeah, it'll get worse. It can get worse. It's not going to crush you. It's not going to destroy you. But it is going to challenge your notion that once you do this, everything's going to be okay. Because life doesn't work that way. It doesn't. I mean, I've been Orthodox now 40 years, something like that. And, and I've had a lot of rough times through it. But it's those rough times. See, it's those rough times that compel the growth. We don't change unless we're compelled to change. We don't. So I've learned not to curse my sufferings and not to think I must be doing something wrong because I'm suffering, right? I've suffered in the priesthood. I've suffered in my Orthodox life, right? But I've learned that it's through that suffering that greater maturation occurs and experience builds. So don't be alarmed by that. And certainly do not think, because you will think this, because we're trained to think this, I must be doing something wrong. I must be failing. God must not want me, right? These are things these are things we have to dispose of. Now,
Right.
you talk to anybody who's got some years under their belt, some experience under the belt, they're going to tell you the exact same thing, because we all went through it. Those experiences that I talked about at the beginning, they're cool stories, but they only happen out of struggle,
Right.
right? I'm not one that gets, angels don't visit me. Okay, the heavens have not opened. But I don't really want that. I want meaning.
Right.
I want understanding, right? And so that comes through struggle, because the habits we've accrued or the categories we function in, sometimes the idols have to be destroyed.
Right.
All right, I call them false crutches, dependencies, right? They got to go, man. They got to go. But when they go, what opens to you is the deeper power of God. That's what happens. And why it relates to manhood, guys, is because each man articulates in himself according to his own gifts, abilities, calling. He has to define for himself, with the help of God, what his role in this world is. And all men are different. No one can compel you. No one can force you. You have to come to a resolve in your own heart who you are. All right. Not that we take on identities, but really discover the who of who you are. And lots of times that comes through hardship. And then also what you're to do in this life. Now, this is something that we grow into. And if we seek Christ and put aside the grumbling, put aside the complaining, put aside that discontent, in all things give thanks to God, the Apostle Paul says, but also be in communion with your brother and with your priest, right? God himself will reveal it to you, but that revelation comes as you grow into it. That's how it happens. And the brotherhood is especially important, because the brotherhood, your communion with your brothers, that communion creates the channel. That is the channel through which God's grace flows. God's grace is not amorphous. It doesn't float around in the energy like a radio wave. It doesn't.
Right.
No, it happens. It happens through communion with your brothers, through connection.
Well,
That's
and
how it
that
works.
leads me perfectly into where I wanted to take you next in regards to the Orthodox Church. Obviously, we're seeing a dramatic increase of young men converting. According to the OCA study that I saw, it was roughly around 80% of men under the age of 45 that were converting to the faith. That was for, I think, 2023. And then I recently saw something shared online that before 2020, and I don't know how accurate these numbers were, they said Orthodox Christianity was generally around 700 some thousand in the US, and in 2024 it was like 7.5 million. So Orthodoxy is seeing a dramatic increase here in the United States, but really all the Western nations. And I wanted to get your perspective on how Orthodoxy addresses many of the things that young men are struggling with. We mentioned identity, hopelessness, meaninglessness, and relationships both with women, but also with other men. I mean, there's recent studies that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is the youngest generation, that they are the most isolated and have the smallest social circles of previous generations. Could you speak to how the church and the way it functions due to God's will actually answers and addresses many of these different things? Could be identity, could be meaning, again, as you're talking about the discipline of the ascetic lifestyle of Orthodox Christianity, and relationships. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. So, is your question is like, what do the fathers, the teachers teach about it, or what's happening in the actual parish?
What's happening in the actual parish for let's say a young man who's 23 years old, doesn't know what he's supposed to do with his life, doesn't have a lot of friends, doesn't have a sense of identity, feels hopeless about the economy, the state of the world, him being able to be a functioning adult and have a house, have a family, and his lack of relationships. The Orthodox Church, I believe, offers answers to these, especially through the participation in the parish life. But if you want to go into the father, however you want to address it, but how do you see the church being a refuge for these young men dealing with these problems of the nihilistic and secular world?
Well, I think the church isn't doing the job it should be. It could be doing better, much better. Okay, that's what I believe. That's not an indictment. It's just to say that I don't think that the church is really prepared for the influx that's coming. Not only here, but that's coming. This is just the beginning. I'm convinced of it. I saw this happening. I saw this coming 6 years ago. I just saw it coming. Yeah. And I would tell the priests in my deanery, this is coming, get ready. And they would kind of listen and dismiss it. I told my bishop. He kind of looked at me like, well, yeah, maybe. And here it is. Here it is.
Yep.
Okay. And so I've got another prediction. This is just the beginning. All right. I think that orthodoxy, if we are faithful to this, will become the ground for the rebuilding of culture.